should be good to go. So Ryan, you're our supervisor of our field team, so you get involved in most of our security events when something goes on inside of one of our clients, right?
Unfortunately, that is correct. Usually, dig in there as soon as anything suspicious or suspected as a breach occurs.
Right, and we have a kind of a built-in escalation process. If something even comes into our service desk team, they know to kind of sniff out for a security event. If it is, it escalates up pretty quickly per our standard operating procedure, right?
Yes, it skips over standard engineers and goes right to the top if any sort of security situation arises where there's any condition where there might be a release of credentials or of any information of any company or client.
Yep. So obviously we were sitting on a Friday before a holiday weekend. I remember seeing the message hit through our service desk team, and I think myself, you, and Travis pretty quickly said, that's an interesting message to come from this particular client, and you got engaged right away. What, we didn't know this was a Kaseya VSA global breach at the time, right? We were dealing in real time with just the information that we had. Can you talk us through kind of that, what you looked at first and what led you to believe that this was a ransomware attack just in the first place?
Yes, so the client has their own IT department, so they had reached out through our help desk system, and they had seen some suspicious file extensions. So some file names that they didn't expect to be there in a particular HR folder that normally just has simple PDFs and other documents, nothing too secure in there, but it still was something that was used very often and didn't look right. So they had shut down that particular server and reached out to us. And so we immediately logged in, loaded those servers into a protected environment. So using a snapshot system from their Nutanix environment, so it could instantly bring up a copy in a protected environment. So there was no risk to disturbing the audit trail for any sort of forensics that would need to be done by law enforcement potentially, so that we were all working off a copy, first of all, to be safe and secure. And then we started digging into what the files looked like, what the file extensions were, and trying to get into the folders, see the extent of the damage, and at the same time determine the origin of the attack. So when we pulled the origin attack, we're able to see basically the identifiers in the Active Directory system that ties it back to a user, and then working backwards, tie it back to their particular machine that seemed to launch the attack, and obviously reach out to those users, which of course on a holiday weekend are working remotely, and get them to immediately shut down their device, and obviously have the plan to bring it in for a more detailed analysis.
Yeah, I was pretty. What was kind of your time to figuring out kind of what the infected SID was? It seemed like you were on that pretty quick.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have done this throughout my career quite a bit from various ransomware attacks. So that part I'm pretty quick at. That was only maybe 5 minutes total from the time I logged onto my machine when I saw the issue onto the client's VPN before I had the server up in the logs, pulled that down and matched it backwards to the SID, or to the actual user, rather.
Right. So you're able to kind of track from SID, what's is a unique signature of a computer within a Windows network for those that aren't super technical, and you're able to track that back to a user. And why is it important to figure out where the user infection point is?
Right, and then of course in this environment we had a different security operations center, a SOC, not ours, to work with on behalf of the client. So then obviously have to provide all this information to them. And we located the beginning of the ransomware attack, essentially, since it was not actively present on the file server. Since the folder is shared, it had access to change those files. But if a virus or a ransomware piece of malware launches that payload on an actual server, there's some other signatures that occur, that some changes it makes to Windows that you can detect, and there was no sign of that. So that's also how we knew that it was not actually the server that was infected, it was the server being attacked via the ransomware on a different infected machine. But obviously using that piece of information, then the SOC and we had to work back together to see what type of data was transmitted back and forth between all those devices, and actually determine that the device that was infected, i.e. the user's machine, was the only infected device on the network, but that wasn't the origin of the breach into the network. So that was actually where the Kaseya piece came into play, because that was actually a different third-party device within the network that was using Kaseya, not even the direct client. And that's where the breach into the network occurred, because that control piece then on that infected device is what was able to attack the domain Windows join device for the actual user that was the infected point.
Right. And I'm just curious, were they able to, using firewall logs and other, tools at their disposal within the network, the Fortinet equipment, determine kind of how much conversation had happened between, the bad actors, not their servers, most likely running in an AWS instance or something like that. It sounds like a lot of these were launched from kind of, we know that after the fact now, 48 hours later, but was that SOC able to determine, or do we not know yet, kind of how much payload went in and out and whether they had exfiltrated data?
We were able to determine, or they were able to determine that it was pretty early on in the attack, since it wasn't even completed on the machine, it seemed like. However, that piece of it, because it was a holiday weekend, they were delivering that, I believe, on either today or tomorrow morning, for full forensic analysis to actually see what else happened with the Windows device. Nothing from the servers appears to be exfiltrated, but until they go through the full process on that laptop, obviously they can't determine that or say that with any sort of certainty.
Sure. Did they just make sure somebody had physical contact with that device to make sure it was offline at that point, or?
Correct. Yeah, that was the IT department of the initial client.
Got it. So, not every client has the ability to just take instant snapshots. What kind of underlying infrastructure did this client have that made the ability to create an isolated snapshot useful? And I don't know if people have really thought about making sure that they've got that level of virtualization as a potential, ransomware tool, right? They were able to really quickly isolate the system and get it into a separated network to, like you said, it sounds like it was caught pretty early in the attack cycle.
Absolutely, and without their, obviously, they have hyper-converged infrastructure. Their particular vendor is Nutanix. Scale is the other one, obviously, we talk about quite a bit, and are very familiar with. Both of those allow near instantaneous snapshots, which basically that means it takes the exact copy of everything running, everything in memory, everything on the hard drive, makes a copy of it, and we can actually make a second VM with all the characteristics, in this case, the attacked and infected version, by change its network infrastructure, put it into basically a network where you can simulate the internet without actually letting it out to the internet, so you can see what kind of traffic it's trying to send back to its control infrastructure. And without something like that, if you're working with a small, maybe you have a small Hyper-V environment or a small VMware environment where you don't have enough storage or perhaps enough memory and CPU to spare, since this was a rather large VM, this was their core file server, so it was many terabytes of data, but we're able to make an instantaneous copy with that level of virtualization that really allowed this process to proceed at a very rapid pace. Otherwise, their downtime would have been increased significantly, having to wait for either another server or another piece of equipment to be put out into the field to actually make copies of all of their running VMs so that they could actually analyze them in that safe environment.
And I recall being at your desk bothering you during this window, and we were pretty anxious to get them back up and running in production, right? We felt like, given that we had snapshots, we had a copy for the chain of, kind of the evidentiary chain. And from your perspective, if we had been given the green light, how quickly could we had the server rolled back to the uninfected point and then back up and operational on that system?
At that point, we could have rolled back to a snapshot that would have been approximately about 45 minutes in terms of time frame before of when the event happened, and we could have completed the whole process within basically half an hour or less of when we made contact and had essentially verified all the data, or basically verified the attack back and forth. We had the infected devices handled. In terms of actual restore time, that was much, much faster. The full restore of the server back took, I believe, a grand total of about 60 seconds. So in terms of restore time in that sort of environment, it's even for a huge, huge, huge VM is extremely, extremely fast.
Good. Well, I mean, and we were trying to, obviously there was an outside SOC involved, and so we were trying to follow their guidance and really we represented the infrastructure management in that moment and kind of let them steer a little bit. Obviously, we were providing them advice, and when we wanted to get the environment back up, right, we view ourselves as overall being responsible for their uptime, and we wanted to bring them back, but understood what the SOC was trying to get at and understand and make sure we have everything right. You've been a part of these before, unfortunately, like you said, and one of the areas of concern when dealing with an active attack is always making sure we have our arms around really what all the involved devices are, right? And I think that was part of what they just wanted to be 1,000% sure that we really had our arms around everything involved in this particular attack in that moment.
Absolutely, yeah. We were ready to go. Basically, anytime the client was confident and the SOC was confident that the attack wasn't going on, and that really was the only point that was slowing down the process. Technically, it could have been done much faster, but always the cautious approach is most appropriate. If you reinfected the network or reinfected files, then obviously you're getting into a situation where people could be losing more work time as you think it is safe to go back to work and actually change a bunch of your files and lose all of that work again.
Right. I assume, given kind of how much we had the situation under control, was there really even ever a conversation about paying a ransom or dealing with any of that nonsense?
Oh no, we had the backups in this situation were far too good, quite frankly, to really worry about that at all. All of the snapshots were done to external devices that were done to DR equipment that were isolated on a separate network that did not have any shares any network shares of any kind back and forth between the actual file server that was infected. So there's no way that next step could have been taken particularly easily by any external attacker or sort of ransomware threat. So air gapping your backups and your replications like that protects you, as well as really the file server itself in this case was also a great benefit. It only had two main file shares of many, many dozens, quite frankly, that were attacked because the client does follow proper isolation procedures so that users are only having access to the files they actually need to perform their job functions. So the footprint of the attack was much, much smaller than, frankly, many of these sorts of attacks I see.
Yeah, I think that as we get to play Monday morning quarterback on it after the fact, luckily without there being any huge impact to this particular customer, which is why I think this is a good one to talk about, because there isn't a lot of crying at the end of it. It has a happy ending. One was time to detection, right? That internal IT team member raising a hand, having a strong partnership with outside vendors that were able to react very quickly and really get in there and stop it. Because we preach about this all the time, right? Everyone is going to have a security event. It's not an if, it's a when. And it's really then about time to detection. And we could see here the difference that it makes to get this attack when it was really, what we believe at this point to be, essentially one infected laptop attacking one area. And then the second part, which you just highlighted, was following that least privilege best practice. It's so easy to say, well, Sally really needs access to those files one time a year, so let's just make a shared drive that everyone has access to. I think this highlights that least privilege. While sometimes it can feel like you're walling things off from employees, well, what if I need to play backup for that user when they're on leave sometime? Really keeping that locked down and taking the time to only give access when it's needed and taking it away when it's not. This is a perfect example, don't you think, of where that really had a huge impact on preventing the spread. And a lot of these attacks, ransomware in particular, really go after file shares, right? They're assuming that the stuff you have in file shares is what's worth paying ransom for. And so I really feel like time to detection and then this least privilege concept really helped make this not as impactful and have a happy ending. What's your take on those?
Both of those, of course, as well as having some sort of SOC on the other end. I would think without that, I'm not sure putting the pieces together of all the infection components and in this case, where the actual origin of the attack into the network was completely separate from basically any of the logs we were seeing in any of the servers from the attack. So that also greatly increased basically the time to declare it safe to bring everything back up.
True. And then the other elements that you highlighted, right? The leveraging hyperconverged, so snapshots were freely available and that there were enough resources available to spin those up without involving a lot of other hardware or any other hardware and other systems. And then there were even more fail safes in place, other copies of data in other places, had we even need to go into those as well. Maybe would have had different restore times, but there's a well-developed DR capability in the environment. Kind of all those things together kind of worked out. It's important to note, like we highlighted, this was a client that we kind of co-manage, and oftentimes we do have the opportunity to have our SOC and some of our security tools in place, and it similarly could have provided us some similar levels of enhanced logging capability and also maybe some insight into what the attack was if we would have had our native tools, SentinelOne, involved here as well. What I know it's hard to predict, but so far, knock on wood, haven't seen one of these events in a customer with SentinelOne active on it. But what data do you think SentinelOne would have potentially showed about this? Given it also was kind of a weird attack coming through what most people would consider a trusted agent, right? Kaseya was an agent used by not us, but by another provider, and probably gets treated as a normal agent, as something that's allowed to run. Any takes on what we see what Huntress Labs and some other products that got to see it in real time. We haven't seen any SentinelOne data on it yet, but any predictions as to what SentinelOne might have seen?
I would expect that SentinelOne would have allowed the Kaseya component in and the actual updater, since that would have been the same sort of whitelisted application. However, where I think it would have differed in this attack significantly is when the file server began its actual crypto locking of the file shares. The way SentinelOne would see that attack and see it using that Windows service would seem incredibly suspicious to it, and should have triggered actually its isolation procedure at that point, and would have likely taken the file server offline to protect it against whatever attack was occurring. So that's what I would have expected it to do, but without actually seeing it, I couldn't say for certain it would. But I have seen that behavior absolutely on Windows desktops in real time with the SentinelOne product. So if it works there, I would expect it to work the same way on the server. So I would expect it to have probably given us an even quicker detection time than we had here, which frankly was, in the grand scheme of things, quite a good detection time.
Yeah, and that's why you're not involved in our sales team. You're not out there trying to convince customers one way or another. But having any tool that has the ability to look for those indications of compromise over traditional antivirus. If you were an engineer that you ran into a customer on the street and they said, "Do we really need to pay more for something that can do something like that?" What would your advice be to any small business or larger business?
Well, that's really easy, because if I ever walk into such places, they ever don't see it, I would even recommend it. I would go that far. It's that important. It costs a little bit more than traditional antivirus, true, but it provides far and away a protection that a traditional antivirus just can't compete with, quite frankly.
Right, and that difference again being that indication, that suspicious behavior, not a file, right? That server probably never saw a malicious file. It just saw malicious activity, right?
Yeah, there's no infected file that exists on that server. It's just text files that are the asking for a ransom, and the files that were modified, which that user had every right to modify files because that folder was shared with her. So the same way you would edit a Word document to, put your own paragraph or insert a picture into it, that basically is the same thing that your infected computer is doing, just on a grander scale to all the files that you're allowed to do that to.
Yeah. Well, appreciate you taking some time to kind of break this down for folks. We're always trying to stay ahead of what's going on. This is an interesting one. Obviously, it's the second time, unfortunately, in 1 week where we saw not ourselves, luckily, knock on wood, but another IT firm have a portion. We had that Screen Connect instance earlier in the week. Were you involved in that one? This is just an honest question. Did you hear about that one?
I don't know. Actually, I don't think I ran through the Screen Connect one, unfortunately.
Yeah, there was a same thing. It was an on-premise Screen Connect instance that got into one of the Milwaukee area customers from another MSP. It was used as a backdoor.
A similar sort of attack vector where it got into one device and then used a different one to attack with it, or?
Correct, that too. But also not, it wasn't Screen Connect like baked into Continuum. Screen Connect is part of a SaaS offering, but this particular MSP had gone out and purchased their own Screen Connect service and appliance, and were using that, and that got compromised, and then got them into backdoors into a lot of their clients.
And just like any on-premise products, when you buy it yourself, you are responsible for setting up the security generally yourself.
Yep. Yeah, we certainly, Travis and I went to, our underlying vendor with a similar tool to what Kaseya and Screen Connect both have. In fact, Screen Connect's now starting to become the standard inside of one of our tools as a remote access technology. But, very different once it's being managed by, in our case, one of the largest technology organizations in the U.S. Has its pros and cons, as you and I work with them all the time. But, on a whole, Travis and I reached out to them to say, I'm sure you're watching this Kaseya thing. It's not impacting us, but I assume other partners are asking you the same thing we are, which is what are you doing to make sure that things like this don't happen? And they actually came back with a response to it, and they have a whole security team that is always checking their own code, and I think that's what Kaseya will probably learn from this is, if they didn't feel they had to shut down, they felt they needed to shut down all of their cloud-based services, which is a pretty big, ripcord to pull. Tells me that they weren't 1,000% confident whatever SOC and security measures they had in place to be able to say, no, we only see this in this on-premise VSA, this particular branch of our solution. We're not seeing it in our SaaS offering. What's your take on Kaseya making the call to really shut off? That's what people thought this was a big deal on Friday, is they had turned off the switch on, 20,000 MSPs probably in the matter of an hour. They just said, nope, you don't have a remote access tool anymore. Because we want to make sure everyone's safe, which is the nice way of saying we're not sure our product is safe.
Yeah, they probably had to be debating whether to go and try to protect everyone, I guess, as they're trying to spin it, or whether or not, as you say, they weren't quite certain if they had the problem contained as much as they had thought initially. I'm glad I'm never in that hot seat, quite frankly, because I'm not sure on which side I would like to come down on. But I would like to hope and think that I would have enough security procedures in place to not have to make that decision as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to read the reports now after the fact. Kaseya hasn't come out with the full explanation or breakdown of what they see has happened, which I assume they'll bring auditors in who will come out publicly with an explanation of exactly what happened. Some of the security agencies that got pulled in, probably because their clients had both Kaseya, which was impacted, and other security tools, right? Whether it be SentinelOne, Sophos, Huntress, Cylance, take your pick. Those security companies are starting to see the log data of the attack and start to make claims about it. Huntress said that they had a pretty high confidence that it was triggered via an authentication bypass vulnerability in the Kaseya VSA web interface, which allowed them then to use SQL injection to execute code, gain access to the VSA, and then use the Kaseya tool, which is built to push updates, or to, if we needed to update a client system, assuming we were using Kaseya, which we weren't, can push out MSIs to do non-nefarious things, but good things to help customers run their businesses more efficiently. And they use those very same tools to backdoor this Revel ransomware in there. Did you see the ransomware variant itself? I think there was an active discussion about the variant going on in the chat with SOC in this case, right?
Yes. So that is actually what they had named it, basically blamed it on the Revit group as well. It was a similar variant, and that is how they actually had traced it back to the Kaseya incident. Was basically based on that signature is what the SOC had used to determine that this was part of this same breach, fortunately.
Yeah. It is interesting to see the community as a whole kind of come together. I had some peers that leverage Kaseya. We don't use Kaseya in particular here at Elevity, but the community that I'm a part of had all reached out and said, hey, if you're finding yourselves impacted and need additional engineering support or whatever, let people know. I think IT companies all know that we could find ourselves in this boat. An IT company leveraging Kaseya as a tool isn't at fault for picking this vendor, right? This is just one of those only matter of time type situations.
Absolutely. Actually, Kaseya was probably one of the other products before I had joined Elevity many years ago that we had looked at switching to. So.
Yep. Yeah, it looks like there's for those that are super interested in diving deep, there's definitely some in the MSP Reddit channels. There's kind of a running discussion going on, including screenshots of the SQL injection itself and some of the other things that bad guys used or believed to have used in this case. So it is interesting to see how they continue to evolve and adapt. And there's no question that managed service providers are a target because we have access to a lot of customers, right? If you can get into our walls, you may have a chance at some of the others, which is always something we're trying to evaluate here at Elevity and making sure we have that separation and we have the right tools and pieces in place for our own business.
Absolutely, and to gain any sort of reason or real access to any sort of client network through us, you'd have to break the normal authentication, the multi-factor authentication of an engineer, and then you'd also have to break a separate authentication and multi-factor authentication to then get the password to any individual client that engineer has access to. So there's not only, basically there's two branches and basically multiple multi-factor authentication protecting every step of the way, which obviously is kind of required when you're dealing with that level of access.
Yeah, and that vendor we utilize, they go through SOC audits. We request and have maintain copies of their SOC Type 2 reports and their security audit reports every year. They understand that their tool that we use through all those steps, is definitely a target as well. And whenever you use a password management system, encryption and securing it's very important. Well, thanks, Ryan, for taking some time, and always interesting to break down when these happen. This one, like I said, has a happy ending, so this one is something that's a little bit easier to talk through. Others we've been involved in, we usually, are able to work through with folks. A lot of interesting tools were available in this one to make the story end quickly and happily for this particular client. But I think lessons learned for everyone else even if you weren't impacted, it's a great example of how you can do everything right. Your outside partners can do everything right, and still a third-party choice of a third party, supply chain attack is really where the bad day started from. And it's just a perfect example of the constant challenge that we're faced and clients are faced with and businesses are faced with, which is why investing in IT is so critical. So Thanks for some time over the holiday weekend, Ryan, and hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. You as well.